January 17, 1991. Captain Steve Tate is flying his KC-135 Stratotanker in a racetrack pattern over Saudi Arabia at 2 a.m. His mission: keep F-15 Strike Eagles fueled up so they can hunt Scud launchers in western Iraq. In the back of his tanker, he's carrying 200,000 pounds of jet fuel. Over the next 6 hours, he'll offload almost all of it to 23 different aircraft. No refueling missions, no Scud hunt. No Scud hunt, Israel enters the war. No tankers, no Desert Storm, it's that simple. Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about the unsung heroes of Desert Storm, the tanker crews. While fighter pilots got the glory and bomber crews got the headlines, none of it would have been possible without hundreds of aerial refueling aircraft keeping everyone flying. Desert Storm used more aerial refueling than any military operation in history. Over 46,000 sorties were flown by coalition aircraft. 15,000 of those, almost a third, were tanker missions. Let me tell you why air refueling was the secret weapon that made the entire air campaign work. Here's the basic problem. Most fighter and attack aircraft can only fly for a few hours before they run out of fuel. An F-16 with a full combat load and external tanks might have a radius of about 500 miles. That means 500 miles out, do your mission, 500 miles back. Sounds like plenty, right? Wrong. Iraq is a big country. Some targets were 800 miles from Saudi air bases. Kuwait targets were closer, but western Iraq where the Scuds were. That's a long way from anywhere. So without aerial refueling, the whole air campaign would have been limited to targets within range of Saudi, Bahraini, and Turkish air bases. We couldn't have hit Baghdad from Saudi Arabia without refueling. We couldn't have kept aircraft on station for extended periods. We couldn't have flown the long-range strikes that crippled Iraqi command and control on day one. The entire strategy depended on being able to refuel aircraft in midair. The coalition had about 300 tanker aircraft available, KC-135s from the Air Force, KC-10s from the Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard, and smaller numbers of tankers from other coalition nations. These aircraft flew around the clock in shifts, orbiting in designated air refueling tracks, waiting for aircraft to show up and gas up. It was like running a gas station in the sky, except the gas station was moving at 300 miles per hour, and the customers were showing up with live weapons. Captain Bill Andrews flew KC-10s during Desert Storm. He described the organized chaos of the tanker tracks. You'd have multiple aircraft showing up at once, all needing fuel. You'd refuel one, he'd disconnect. The next guy would move into position immediately. Sometimes you'd have aircraft stacked up waiting their turn. And you're doing all this at night in radio silence with the possibility of Iraqi aircraft or surface-to-air missiles. It was intense. Let me explain how air refueling actually works, because it's more complicated than it looks. The Air Force uses the boom method. The tanker, usually a KC-135 or KC-10, has a boom operator who lies face down in the back of the aircraft, looking out a window at the aircraft behind them. The boom is a rigid pipe that extends from the tanker. The receiving aircraft flies in close formation underneath and behind the tanker. The boom operator flies the boom down and plugs it into a receptacle on top of the receiving aircraft, and fuel flows. Sounds simple. It's not. The receiving aircraft is flying maybe 30 feet behind a much larger aircraft in the turbulence from that aircraft's engines and wings. The boom operator has to fly this 40-foot-long rigid pipe into a receptacle that's maybe 3 feet in diameter, and both aircraft are moving at 300 to 500 miles per hour. It's like trying to thread a needle while riding a motorcycle. At night, in bad weather, with the needle also on a motorcycle. Now imagine you're an F-15 pilot, you've been flying for 3 hours, you're low on fuel and you need to rendezvous with a tanker. You navigate to the tanker track coordinates, find the tanker visually or on radar, close in, position yourself behind and below, and wait for the boom operator to plug you in. If you've done this 100 times, it's routine. If you're tired or it's your first combat refueling or the weather's bad, it can be nerve-wracking. Major Randy O'Boyle was an F-16 pilot who flew 38 combat missions during Desert Storm. He said night refueling was always challenging. You're flying formation on this huge tanker that you can barely see because everyone's in lights-out mode. You're trying to hold position in the turbulence. The boom operator is trying to connect. If you move wrong, the boom can strike your aircraft. I saw a pilot crack his canopy when the boom hit it during a rough disconnect. He had to abort his mission and go home. The tanker crews were flying incredibly long missions. 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours in the air. The KC-135 is based on a Boeing 707 airframe from the 1950s. It's not a comfortable aircraft. No flight attendants, no in-flight meal service, just a cockpit, a boom operator station, and a flying gas tank. The crew would be exhausted by the end of these missions, but they had to stay focused because one mistake during refueling could be catastrophic. Staff Sergeant Mark Peterson was a boom operator on a KC-135. He described a mission early in the war where he refueled 47 aircraft in a single sortie. 47. That's refueling one aircraft, disconnecting, refueling another, over and over for hours. My arms were sore from flying the boom. My eyes were burning from staring out the window. But every one of those aircraft needed gas to complete their mission, so you just kept doing it. The tanker tracks were positioned strategically around Iraq and Kuwait. There were tracks in Saudi Arabia for aircraft hitting targets in southern Iraq and Kuwait, tracks over the Persian Gulf for Navy aircraft operating off carriers, tracks in Turkey for aircraft hitting northern Iraq, and critically, tracks in western Saudi Arabia for aircraft hunting Scuds. The Air Force had to plan this like a massive logistics operation, making sure tankers were where they needed to be when aircraft needed them. Sometimes the planning broke down. Captain Dave Jones was flying an F-15 Echo Strike Eagle on a Scud hunting mission when he arrived at his tanker track and the tanker wasn't there. Weather had delayed the tanker's takeoff. Jones was now low on fuel in enemy airspace with no gas station. He had to abort his mission, use his remaining fuel to get to an emergency tanker track farther south, and hope there was a tanker there with gas to spare. That was probably the most stressful 15 minutes of my life, he later said. Watching the fuel gauge drop, knowing I was too far from base to make it without a tanker. The Navy used a different refueling system called probe and drogue. The tanker trails a hose with a drogue, basically a basket, at the end. The receiving aircraft has a probe that it flies into the drogue. It's more flexible than the Air Force boom system, but transfers fuel slower. Navy KA-6 and KS-3 tankers were supporting carrier aircraft over the Gulf. Marine KC-130 tankers were supporting Marine aircraft operating from bases in Saudi Arabia. Coalition coordination was critical. British, French, Italian, Canadian, they all had aircraft operating in the same airspace. Some of them needed American tankers because they didn't have enough of their own. The Air Force had to share tanker resources while making sure American aircraft got priority. There were a few tense moments where coalition aircraft showed up at the same tanker track at the same time, all needing fuel, and the tanker only had enough for some of them. One story that illustrates the danger these tanker crews faced. On February 2, 1991, a KC-135 tanker callsign Exxon 08 was refueling aircraft near the Iraq-Saudi border. An Iraqi fighter, possibly a Mirage F-1 flown by a deserter trying to escape, crossed the border heading south. Saudi F-15 pilots intercepted it and shot it down, but for a few minutes that Iraqi fighter was in the same airspace as the unarmed tanker. If the fighter had targeted the tanker instead of trying to escape, the crew would have been helpless. Tankers occasionally had to evade surface-to-air missiles too. There are reports of KC-10s orbiting in tracks near the border detecting missile launches and having to break orbit and maneuver. These were not maneuverable aircraft. They're basically flying fuel tanks designed for straight-10 level flight, not aerobatics. The thought of a KC-10 loaded with 200,000 pounds of jet fuel trying to dodge a SAM is terrifying.
Let's talk numbers to give you a sense of the scale. During the 43 days of Desert Storm, coalition tankers offloaded over 125 million gallons of fuel. That's enough to fill over 190 Olympic swimming pools. The average tanker mission lasted 8 to 10 hours and refueled 15 to 20 aircraft. Some missions refueled over 40 aircraft. The coordination required to make this work was mind-boggling. The most critical missions were probably the opening night package strikes. Remember Task Force Normandy, the Apache helicopters that took out Iraqi radar sites in the first minutes of the war? They were refueled by Air Force Special Operations MH-53 Pave-Low helicopters modified to carry extra fuel. Then there was Package Q on Day 2, the largest strike package of the war. Over 100 aircraft hitting targets in Baghdad simultaneously. Every one of those aircraft needed to refuel at least once, some multiple times. Major Tom Griffith was flying a KC-10 supporting Package Q. He said managing that many aircraft was like air traffic control on steroids. You'd have F-16 packages showing up, then F-15 Echoes, then F-111 bombers, all at different altitudes, all needing different amounts of fuel. You're coordinating through AWACS who's next, how much fuel each type needs, making sure everyone gets enough gas to complete their mission and make it home. The B-52 bombers were especially dependent on tankers. These huge strategic bombers flew from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, over 2,500 miles away, or from bases in Britain and Spain. They'd launch, refuel multiple times on the way to Iraq, drop their bombs, refuel again on the way back. A single B-52 mission might require 3 or 4 separate refuelings. Without tankers, the B-52s couldn't have participated in Desert Storm at all. Tanker crews also provided an important secondary function, search and rescue coordination. If an aircraft went down, the tanker overhead often had the best communications equipment and the most complete picture of what aircraft were in the area. Several times, tanker crews coordinated rescue helicopters to down pilots. In at least one case, a tanker crew spotted a pilot's parachute and guided rescue forces to his location. The psychological comfort of knowing tankers were available was huge for strike pilots. Captain Mike Roberts flew F-16 missions and said knowing there were multiple tanker tracks available was reassuring. If your primary tanker track had a problem, you could divert to an alternate. If you took battle damage and were leaking fuel, there were emergency tankers standing by. The tanker system gave us confidence to press deep into Iraq because we knew we'd have gas to get home.
There were failures and close calls. One KC-135 developed a fuel leak in its boom system and had to abort, stranding a flight of F-16s without gas. They diverted to an emergency tanker track, but arrived with critically low fuel. Another tanker had a boom malfunction where it wouldn't disconnect from an F-15. The fighter had to fly in formation with the tanker for 20 minutes while the boom operator tried to fix the problem. Finally, they got it disconnected, but it was a tense situation. The most dangerous moment for tanker crews was probably during the Scud hunts in western Iraq. Those tankers were orbiting near hostile territory, supporting aircraft that were deep in Iraq looking for mobile Scud launchers. If one of those aircraft got shot down or damaged, the tanker might have to risk moving closer to hostile airspace to help get them home. Several tanker crews did exactly that, moving into areas where they could potentially be targeted to help damaged aircraft make it back. After Desert Storm, military analysts did studies on what had made the air campaign so successful. Air refueling was right at the top of the list. The ability to keep hundreds of aircraft flying for extended periods, to hit targets anywhere in Iraq, regardless of distance from air bases, to maintain combat air patrols and Scud hunts continuously. All of it depended on having a robust aerial refueling capability. The tanker crews never got the recognition they deserved. No tanker crew got a Distinguished Flying Cross or Silver Star for their Desert Storm service, even though they flew some of the longest and most demanding missions of the war. The fighter pilots who got awards for bombing missions or air-to-air kills, they all got gas from tankers to make those missions possible. But tanker crews operated in relative obscurity. I want you to understand something. When you see footage of F-15s taking off to fly combat missions, or A-10 strafing Iraqi positions, or B-52s dropping bombs, Every one of those missions was enabled by tanker crews who flew long, boring, exhausting missions in unarmed aircraft, providing the fuel that made everything else possible. They were the logistical backbone of the air campaign. Staff Sergeant Peterson, the boom operator I mentioned earlier, summed it up well in an interview years after the war. He said, "We didn't drop bombs. We didn't shoot down enemy aircraft. We just made sure everyone else could do their jobs. If that meant flying 14-hour missions and refueling 50 aircraft, that's what we did. Somebody had to do it, and we were proud to be the ones keeping everyone flying." Desert Storm proved that modern air warfare absolutely depends on aerial refueling. No refueling, no sustained air operations. No sustained air operations, no air supremacy. No air supremacy, the ground war becomes much harder and costlier. The tanker crews were essential to the entire campaign, even if they never fired a shot or dropped a bomb. So next time you see footage of Desert Storm and watch those dramatic combat missions, remember that there were KC-135s and KC-10s orbiting somewhere nearby, filled with fuel, ready to support those missions. The tanker war was invisible to most people, but it was absolutely critical to victory. Without those boom operators and tanker pilots doing their unglamorous job day and night for 43 days, Desert Storm as we know it wouldn't have been possible. If you served as a tanker crew member during Desert Storm, or if you were a pilot who depended on those tankers, leave a comment below. These are the unsung heroes who made the whole thing work. Thanks for watching Gulf War Chronicles. If you appreciate us highlighting the people who don't usually get the spotlight, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.